She was just the girl who cleaned his floors, quiet, invisible, never meant to matter, until she became the only woman he ever loved and the one he couldn't protect. She vanished without a goodbye. 18 months later, the Dragon of Seoul received a message that shattered his empire and brought him to his knees. Your daughter has your eyes, and she needs your strength. The Seoul skyline was a blur of neon and rained through the window of Kang Dae-heon's penthouse. At 50, he was a man of silver hair and ink-stained skin, a king who had everything but felt nothing. For 18 months, the silence of his halls had been a physical weight, the silence Amara Belle left behind. She was the light in his dark corridors, a woman of deep brown skin and soft smiles who saw the man behind the monster. He let her go because a dragon cannot protect a butterfly without crushing its wings. But then, a single encrypted photo arrives on his desk, a baby girl with his piercing eyes, cradled in Amara's tired arms. The caption is 3 words: "She has your heart." In that moment, the boss of the Kang syndicate realizes he hasn't been living. He's just been waiting for a reason to burn the world down to find them. Wait, just a moment, please. We have a small goal of reaching 10,000 subscribers, and your support would truly mean a lot to us. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing. Thank you for being here with us. The penthouse atop the Kang Tower was a temple of cold marble and tinted glass, a fortress that mirrored the man who owned it. Kang Dae-heon stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the neon arteries of Seoul pulsing far below his feet. At 50, he was a man of silver hair and ink-stained skin, his body a map of every war he had fought to sit on this throne. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit jacket, the movement revealing the dark tattoos that climbed his neck and disappeared into the crisp white collar of his shirt. He was the Dragon of Seoul, a king who had everything money and blood could buy, yet he lived in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. For 18 months, that silence had been his only companion. It was the silence Amara Belle had left behind when she vanished into the night without a single word. She had been the only person in his long, violent life who didn't look at him with fear or greed. She was his maid, a woman of deep brown skin and quiet grace who had found the fractured soul beneath his armor. Their affair had been a secret fire, a forbidden heat that made him forget he was a monster. But he had let her go, convinced that his world was a cage of thorns that would eventually draw her blood. He thought he was being noble. He thought he was giving her a chance to breathe air that didn't smell of gunpowder. A soft chime from his desk broke his reverie. It was an encrypted notification, a ghost in the machine that bypassed his layers of security. Dae-heon turned, his movements predatory and precise. He picked up the sleek black device, his thumb hovering over the screen. The image that loaded didn't just freeze his blood. It shattered the very foundation of the life he had built. It was a photo, raw and unpolished. Amara was there, her hair pulled back into a neat, low bun, her expression a mix of exhaustion and fierce maternal love. She looked thinner, her eyes shadowed by the kind of weariness that comes from survival, but it wasn't Amara who brought the dragon to his knees. Cradled against her chest was an infant, barely a few months old. The baby was wrapped in a simple light gray outfit, her small face turned upward in a peaceful sleep. Even through the digital grain of the photo, the resemblance was undeniable. The child had the same high arc of his brow, the same stubborn set of his jaw. She was a perfect, tiny fusion of his darkness and Amara's light. Below the image, 3 words appeared in a text box, glowing white against the dark screen. She has your heart. The whiskey glass in Dae-heon's hand hit the floor, the aged amber liquid splashing across his expensive rug, but he didn't notice. His lungs felt tight, as if the air in the penthouse had suddenly vanished. For 18 months, he had told himself she was better off without him. He had told himself that his legacy would end with his own death, a lineage of violence stopped by his own hand. He was wrong. He had a daughter. Dae-heon sank into the leather chair, his gaze fixed on the sleeping face of the child, Harin. The name tasted like salvation on a tongue that had known only sin. His hands, which had broken bones and signed death warrants, trembled as he traced the outline of the baby's cheek on the cold glass of the screen. The silence of the penthouse was gone, replaced by a roar in his ears that sounded like a war cry. Amara hadn't just run to escape him, she had run to protect his heir from the very shadow he cast. And now she was reaching out. She was calling him home. Dae-heon stood up, the vulnerability in his eyes hardening into a resolve that would make the underworld tremble. He was no longer just a boss or a dragon. He was a father. And God help anyone who stood between him and the daughter he never knew he had. Where Dae-heon begins the brutal search to find where Amara has been hiding. The search did not begin with a roar, but with a surgical, quiet fury. Kang Dae-heon did not move from his desk for 6 hours, his silver hair catching the dim light of the desk lamp as he tore through the digital footprints of a woman who had tried her best to become a ghost. To the world, he was the dragon of Seoul, a man of muscle and ink who commanded legions. But tonight, he was a tracker, sifting through the echoes of a life Amara Belle had built in the shadows of his own empire. He bypassed the official channels of the Kang Syndicate, trusting no one with the knowledge of the child. Instead, he used private servers to track the small, desperate breadcrumbs of a woman surviving on the fringes. He found a closed bank account, a trail of bus tickets paid for in crumpled bills, and finally, a medical record flagged under a false name in a clinic 3 hours south of the city. As he drove toward the coast, the rain lashed against the windshield of his black sedan, mirroring the turbulence in his chest. He stopped at a dilapidated apartment complex on the edge of a fishing village, a place of salt air and peeling paint that was a world away from the marble floors Amara used to polish in his penthouse. Stepping out into the downpour, Dae-heon felt the weight of his tailored suit, an armor that suddenly felt suffocatingly heavy. He found the landlord, a man whose eyes widened at the sight of Dae-heon's tattooed neck and the cold authority in his gaze. A few bills changed hands, and the man began to talk, painting a picture of Amara's life that cut deeper than any blade. He learned of the quiet girl who worked 3 jobs, scrubbing floors in the morning and packing fish at night, all while cradling a growing belly she tried to hide under oversized sweaters. The landlord spoke of how she would sit on the communal porch at dusk, looking toward the north, toward Seoul, with an expression that was both longing and terrified. Dae-heon walked into the tiny, vacant room she had occupied until only weeks ago. It was barely larger than his walk-in closet, smelling of cheap detergent and the faint, lingering scent of the jasmine oil she used to wear. In the corner, he found a discarded wooden crate that had been padded with old blankets to serve as a makeshift crib. He ran his calloused, ink-covered fingers over the rough wood. The realization hit him like a physical blow. While he had been mourning her loss in a tower of gold, she had been fighting for every breath, protecting his blood in a room that didn't even have a heater. She hadn't left because she stopped loving him. She had left because she knew his world offered no room for the vulnerability of a mother and child. He found a small, torn scrap of paper tucked into a floorboard, a drawing of a dragon, crude but unmistakable, sketched in the margins of a grocery receipt. She had been keeping his memory alive for a daughter who would never know him, even as she fled from the danger his name carried. Dae-heon stepped back into the rain, his jaw set in a hard line. He finally understood the depth of the maid's shadow. Amara hadn't just vanished. She had sacrificed everything to keep Harin's existence a secret from the vipers in his inner circle, who would see the child as nothing more than a weakness to be exploited. The search was no longer just about finding her. It was about proving to the woman who had lived in his shadow that he was finally ready to step into the light and be the shield she and their daughter deserved. The rain in the coastal village of Gyeongpo did not fall. It drifted in a heavy, salt-thick mist that clung to the skin like a shroud. Kang Dae-heon moved through the narrow alleyways, his tall, muscular frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the dim light of the street lamps. He was a man of steel and ink, out of place among the weathered fishing nets and the smell of drying kelp, yet his focus remained unbroken. Every step toward the small, lantern-lit cottage at the edge of the sea felt like a step toward a judgment he wasn't sure he would survive. He reached a weathered wooden door and paused. For a man who had faced down rival syndicates without flinching, his hand trembled as he reached for the latch. He didn't knock. He simply pushed it open. The interior was small and smelled of steamed rice and baby powder, a scent so domestic it made his heart ache with a sudden, sharp longing. Amara was standing by a low table, her deep brown skin glowing in the amber light. She was dressed in a simple, dark, long-sleeved dress with a white collar, looking every bit the graceful, quiet woman who had once been the heartbeat of his home. In her arms, she cradled a bundle wrapped in light gray cloth. At the sound of the door, she froze. Her eyes met his, and for a long moment, the only sound was the rhythmic thrum of the rain on the roof. "Dae-heon," she whispered, her voice a fragile bridge across 18 months of silence. "You should have told me, Amara," he said, his voice gravelly and raw. He stepped closer, his silver hair damp from the mist, his gaze fixed on the small, sleeping face of the infant in her arms. Amara didn't pull away. Instead, she adjusted her hold, letting him see the child clearly for the first time. Harin was perfect. She had her mother's peaceful brow and Dae-heon's unmistakable, sharp features. As if sensing a new presence, the baby stirred, her tiny hand reaching out of the gray fabric to brush against Amara's chest. The sight brought the dragon of Seoul to his knees, not out of defeat, but out of a sudden, overwhelming reverence. He looked upward at Amara and his daughter with a serious, contemplative, and tender expression. "I ran to save her from your world," Amara said, her eyes welling with tears as she looked down at the baby. "I didn't want her to be a secret. I didn't want her to be a target." Dae-heon reached out, his large, tattooed hand hovering inches from the infant's cheek. He was terrified that his touch, stained by decades of violence, would somehow mar her. But then, he let his finger graze the baby's soft skin. The warmth of her life sent a jolt through him that no bullet ever could. "She is a Kang," he vowed, his voice low and dangerous with a new kind of protective fire. "And from this moment on, the world will have to go through me to get to her, both of you." Amara let out a shaky breath, leaning slightly toward him as he stood back up, his posture protective and close. The rain continued to lash against the small cottage, but inside, the silence was finally broken by the soft, rhythmic breathing of a child who had just changed the fate of the Korean underworld. The warmth of the small cottage felt like a lie compared to the chilling truth that hung between them. Dae-heon remained close, his presence a towering wall of shadow and silver, but his eyes never left Harin. He watched the way the infant's chest rose and fell, a delicate rhythm that seemed far too fragile for the world he inhabited. Amara shifted her weight, the floorboards groaning softly underfoot as she tightened her protective hold on their daughter. "I didn't leave because the love was gone, Dae-heon," she began, her voice barely audible over the relentless drumming of the rain against the roof. "I left because your love had become a beacon for your enemies." Dae-heon's jaw tightened, the ink on his neck shifting as his muscles tensed. He had always known his name carried a price, but he had naively believed he could pay it alone. Amara looked toward the window, her gaze fixed on the darkness outside as if she could still see the ghosts of that final week in Seoul. It started with the phone calls. Silent at first, then whispers. They knew everything, the floor of the penthouse where I slept, the scent of the tea I made for you, the exact date of my first prenatal appointment. She took a shaky breath, her eyes returning to his. "One afternoon, while you were at the docks dealing with the shipment dispute, a man met me at the market. He didn't use a gun. He just showed me a photo of you through a sniper's lens, and then a photo of me. He told me that a dragon's heir is either a crown or a curse. He said that if I stayed, they wouldn't just kill me. They would wait until she was born and use her to bleed you dry, piece by piece, until the Kang syndicate was nothing but a memory." The silence that followed was suffocating. Dae-heon felt a familiar, cold rage beginning to coil in his gut, the kind of heat that usually preceded a massacre. He realized now that his rivals hadn't just been watching him, they had been hunting the only part of him that was still human. "I received a package the morning I vanished," Amara continued, her voice trembling. "It was a silver rattle, identical to the one your father supposedly gave you. There was a note. It said, 'A dragon without a nest is just a target.' I realized then that as long as I was by your side, she was a hostage before she even took her first breath. I couldn't let her be a pawn in your wars." Dae-heon reached out, his large, tattooed hand finally coming to rest on Amara's shoulder. The fabric of her dress was thin, and he could feel the tremors racking her body. He had spent 50 years building a kingdom of iron and blood, only to find that the walls he had raised had become a prison for the woman he loved. "They thought they could use you to break me," he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal hum that promised a reckoning. "But they didn't account for one thing." He leaned down, his forehead pressing briefly against hers, the silver of his hair contrasting with the deep brown of her skin. "They gave me a reason to stop playing by the rules of the syndicate. I'm not just protecting a territory anymore, Amara. I'm protecting my life." He looked down at Harin, who remained blissfully unaware of the storm her existence had unleashed. The revelation of the threats didn't make him want to hide them away again. It made him want to build a fortress so high that even the sun couldn't touch them without his permission. The maid had run to save the child, but the dragon had arrived to end the hunt. The return to Seoul was not a homecoming. It was a tactical deployment. Under the cover of a moonless sky and a phalanx of his most trusted, silent guards, Kang Dae-heon moved Amara and Harin into the apex of the Kang Tower. The penthouse, once a minimalist monument to his isolation, had been transformed in a matter of hours. The scent of jasmine oil now battled the sterile smell of newly installed reinforced glass and high-grade air filtration systems. Dae-heon led Amara through the sprawling living area, his hand resting firmly at the small of her back, a protective anchor in a world that had once terrified her. He stopped before a heavy, soundproofed door that had been carved out of his primary office suite. When he pushed it open, Amara let out a soft, staggered breath. It was a nursery, but unlike any other. The walls were reinforced with ballistic plating disguised behind soft, cream-colored silk panels. Thermal sensors hummed invisibly in the ceiling, calibrated to recognize the specific heat signatures of Amara and the infant. In the center of the room sat a crib of hand-carved oak, surrounded by monitors that displayed 360-degree feeds of the building's perimeter and the hallways leading to this sanctuary. It was a glass fortress, a high-tech cradle designed by a man who knew exactly how the world tried to break beautiful things. "You turned your home into a prison," Amara whispered, her eyes scanning the flickering blue lights of the security consoles. She held Harin tighter, the infant appearing even smaller against the backdrop of such clinical, cold efficiency. "I turned it into a stronghold," Dae-heon corrected, his voice a low rumble that vibrated with a new, singular purpose. He moved to the window, looking out at the city that lay at his feet. The neon lights of Seoul reflected off his silver hair and the intricate tattoos on his hands, making him look like a relic of a violent past guarding a fragile future. Outside these walls, they see a weakness to be exploited. Inside, they find only a dragon who has finally found something worth defending. He turned back to her, his gaze softening as it landed on the baby resting in her arms. For the first time in 18 months, the silence of the penthouse didn't feel like a vacuum. It felt like a held breath. He had brought them back into the heart of the danger, but he had also brought them into his soul. Dae-heon stepped toward the crib, his muscular frame looming over the oak rails. He adjusted a setting on a nearby tablet, dimming the lights to a warm, golden hue that mimicked the sunset they had left behind at the coast. "Sleep, Amara," he said, his expression serious and contemplative. "My men are at every door, and my eyes are on every screen. For the first time since she was born, you don't have to stay awake to keep her safe." As Amara cautiously laid the sleeping Harin into the crib, the reality of their new life settled over them. They were back in the gilded cage, but the bars were now electrified by a father's wrath. The dragon's heir was no longer a secret. She was the new center of his empire, and the fortress was ready for the storm that was surely coming. The blue light of the security monitors cast a ghostly glow over Kang Dae-heon's silver hair as he watched the silent feed of the nursery. Within the glass fortress he had constructed, the world was still, but the storm inside his own chest refused to subside. He was a man of steel and ink, a patriarch of the underworld who had commanded thousands with a single word, yet he found himself frozen at the threshold of the room that held his heart. Amara sat in a velvet armchair near the crib, her deep brown skin a striking contrast to the cream-colored silk panels of the walls. She looked up as he entered, her expression soft and introspective. She saw the hesitation in the way he adjusted his tailored suit jacket, the way his gaze lingered on the sleeping infant. "She's awake, Dae-heon," Amara whispered, her voice a gentle invitation. The dragon of Seoul stepped forward, his heavy boots silent on the plush rug. Harin was indeed awake, her small, dark eyes blinking with a quiet curiosity that mirrored his own. Amara rose and, with a grace that made his breath hitch, held the baby out toward him. Dae-heon hesitated. His hands were a map of his violent history, covered in tattoos that told stories of betrayal and survival. These were hands that had broken bones and signed death warrants. They felt far too coarse for the velvet skin of a miracle. "I might break her," he rumbled, his voice gravelly with a vulnerability he hadn't shown in decades. "You won't," Amara promised, placing the small bundle into his arms. The weight of the child was nearly nothing, yet it felt more significant than the entire empire he had built. Dae-heon's posture was stiff, his muscular arms tensing as he tried to find a balance between protection and gentleness. He looked downward with a serious, contemplative expression, his silver beard brushing against the light gray fabric of Harin's outfit. His thumb, marked with the ink of a dragon's scale, brushed accidentally against her tiny palm. Instantly, her small fingers curled around it, a grip so fragile yet so absolute that it brought the boss of the Kang syndicate to his knees emotionally. He leaned slightly forward, his gaze directed toward the baby with an attentiveness that signaled a profound transformation. In this quiet, golden-hued sanctuary, the feared criminal vanished. There was only a man and the daughter he never knew he needed. He realized that his flaw, his belief that love was a tactical error, was crumbling under the weight of a single, soft breath. Amara watched them, her posture gentle and nurturing as she saw the monster find his humanity. The steel in Dae-heon's spirit hadn't disappeared, it had simply found a new purpose. He would still burn the world down if he had to, but now he would do it to keep this softness safe. "Would you like me to continue with the next chapter, where a rival syndicate attempts to strike at the dragon's new heart?" The piece of the glass fortress was a fragile illusion, shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden, chilling red strobe of a silent alarm. Kang Dae-heon was in the kitchen, his hand frozen over a bottle of water, as the digital interface on the wall flickered with a single word: breach. He moved with the lethal grace of a predator, his suit jacket discarded as he sprinted toward the nursery. He found the heavy door hanging open, the magnetic lock hissed into submission by a high-end disruptor. Inside, the room was empty. The oak crib was still, but the rocking chair where Amara had been sitting was overturned. A single light gray baby blanket lay on the floor, discarded in the struggle. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic hollow sound he hadn't felt in 50 years. He checked the security feed on his wrist tablet. The footage showed a blur of black-clad figures moving through a service elevator he had thought was decommissioned. They had Amara. She was struggling, her face a mask of terror, but there was no sign of Harin. Then he saw it. Amara had shoved the child into the hidden laundry chute, a desperate, split-second gamble, moments before she was dragged away. A phone rang on the mahogany desk, the vibration rattling the fine crystal glassware. Dae-heon answered it, his voice a low, guttural growl that promised death. "Speak." "The dragon has a soft underbelly after all," a voice sneered. It was Park, the leader of the rival White Tiger Syndicate, a man who had been nursing a blood debt since Dae-heon took the docks 3 years ago. "We have the maid, Dae-heon. She tells us nothing, but her eyes say everything. You have 1 hour to come to the old shipyard alone. Bring the deed to the Guriangpo territory, or we send her back to you in pieces." "If you touch her," Dae-heon said, his silver hair catching the red light of the emergency lamps, "there will be no hole deep enough in this city to hide you from me." "Empty threats from a man who lost his shadow," Park laughed. 1 hour, tick-tock, old man." Dae-heon hung up and moved to the laundry room. He found Harin at the bottom of the padded chute, startled and wide-eyed but unhurt. He picked her up, her tiny weight grounding his spiraling rage. For a moment, his stoic mask cracked. He pressed his forehead against hers, his tattooed hands trembling with a mixture of terror and resolve. He couldn't take her with him, and he couldn't leave her here with a compromised security team. he summoned his most loyal lieutenant, a man who had bled for him for 20 years. "Guard her with your life," Dae-heon commanded, handing the infant over. "If I do not return, take her to the safe house in Jeju. She is the only thing that matters now." Dae-heon walked to the gun's safe, his movements cold and mechanical. He didn't just arm himself, he prepared for a massacre. He knew it was a trap. He knew Park didn't just want the territory, he wanted the dragon's head on a spike. But Park had made a fatal error. He had mistaken a father's love for a weakness, when in reality it was the only thing that made a monster truly dangerous. Leaving the tower, the rain began to pour once more, a dark omen over the Seoul skyline. Dae-heon stepped into his sedan, the engine roaring to life like a beast waking from a long slumber. He was going to pay the blood debt in full, and he was going to bring Amara home. The shipyard was a skeleton of rusted iron and salt-corroded cranes, a graveyard of forgotten industry that suited the dark business at hand. Kang Dae-heon stepped out of his car, the heavy rain instantly drenching his white shirt and causing the ink on his chest and neck to bleed through the wet fabric like shadows emerging from the deep. He did not look like a businessman or a diplomat. He looked like a force of nature carved from silver and scars. Park stood in the center of a flooded warehouse, surrounded by a dozen men armed with submachine guns. Amara was bound to a chair behind them, a bruise blooming on her cheek, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and a desperate, silent plea for him to turn back. "You came alone," Park shouted over the roar of the storm, a jagged smile twisting his face. "The great dragon, brought to heel by a girl who used to scrub his floors." Dae-heon didn't stop walking. His pace was steady, a rhythmic march toward a reckoning. "I gave you an hour," he said, his voice a low, guttural vibration that seemed to cut through the thunder. "You used that hour to sign your own death warrants." "Kill him," Park screamed, his bravado snapping under the weight of Dae-heon's gaze. The warehouse erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, but Dae-heon was already moving. He was a blur of violence and precision, a man fueled by a purpose far more potent than territory or pride. He didn't just fight, he dismantled. Every strike of his tattooed hands was a testament to the 18 months of silence he had endured and the tiny life currently waiting for him in a glass fortress. He used the environment as a weapon, swinging a rusted chain to shatter a collarbone and using a fallen enemy as a shield against a spray of bullets. His suit jacket was long gone, his unbuttoned collar flapping as he moved with a lethal, predatory grace that left Park's men crumpled in his wake. He was no longer a man afraid of his own darkness. He was using that darkness to burn a path toward the light. Blood, thick and dark, splashed against the concrete, mixing with the rainwater. When the final guard fell, only Park remained, cowering near the chair where Amara sat. The rival boss reached for a hidden pistol, but Dae-heon was faster. He closed the distance in 3 strides, his hand, the same hand that had clumsily cradled Harin hours before, clamping around Park's throat with the strength of a hydraulic press. Dae-heon leaned in close, his silver hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes burning with a serious, contemplative fury. "You made a mistake," he whispered into Park's ear. "You thought the child was my weakness. You didn't realize she was my reason." With a sickening crack, the threat to his family was extinguished. Dae-heon turned away from the body before it even hit the floor. His hands were shaking as he knelt before Amara, his expression shifting from a monster's wrath to a father's tenderness. He sliced through her bonds with a pocket knife, his touch lingering on her wrists to ensure she was whole. "Harin," she gasped, her voice cracking as she clutched at his soaked shirt. "Safe," he promised, pulling her into his protective embrace. "She is safe, and so are you." As they walked out of the warehouse, the storm began to break, the neon lights of the distant city reflecting in the puddles like a crown of glass. The dragon had finished his war, but for the first time in 50 years, he wasn't looking back at the bodies. He was looking forward to the quiet room where his daughter slept, knowing that the world was finally small enough to be held in his arms. The aftermath of the shipyard slaughter did not result in the usual celebratory feast of the Kang Syndicate. Instead, a heavy, expectant stillness descended upon the high-rise tower. Kang Dae-heon stood in the center of his boardroom, his silver hair neatly styled back and his tailored suit jacket replaced, though the fresh bandages beneath his white shirt remained a secret to all but Amara. His lieutenants sat in rigid silence, their eyes fixed on the man who had, in a single night, dismantled a rival family with the savagery of a cornered beast. But as the dragon of Seoul looked around the table, he no longer saw assets or soldiers. He saw the machinery of a world that had tried to consume his daughter before she could even walk. He leaned forward, his tattooed hands resting flat on the polished mahogany, his expression serious and contemplative. "The era of the Kang syndicate as a shadow of violence ends today," he announced, his voice a low, resonant hum that brooked no argument. "From this moment, we transition. Our investments will be legitimate, our influence transparent. We are moving our capital into infrastructure, technology, and the future." A murmur of confusion rippled through the room. One senior advisor cleared his throat. "Sir, the transition will cost billions. Our rivals will see this as a retreat. They will think the dragon has grown soft." Dae-heon's gaze shifted to the door, which opened to reveal Amara. She walked with a slim, graceful build, her deep brown skin glowing in the soft light of the office. In her arms, she cradled Harin, who was dressed in a simple, light gray outfit. The room went deathly silent. It was the first time the syndicate had seen the source of the recent war. "They will think I have grown soft until they see what I am willing to do to protect the world I am building for my heir," Dae-heon said, his posture protective and close as he stepped away from the table to meet Amara. He looked downward at the sleeping infant with a tender gravity. "My daughter will not grow up in the shadows. She will not have to hide her name or her father's face." He reached out, his ink-stained fingers brushing the infant's cheek with a gentleness that stunned the men in the room. He was no longer a man who believed love was a tactical error. He had realized that his daughter was the only legacy worth leaving. Dae-heon turned back to his lieutenants, his eyes hardening with the steel of a king who had finally found his purpose. "We are no longer a gang. We are a legacy. Anyone who cannot adapt to this new era may leave now with their lives. Anyone who stays will help me build a city safe enough for a child to sleep in." No one moved. As the sun began to rise over Seoul, casting a golden light through the reinforced glass of the penthouse, the transition began. Amara looked at Dae-heon, her expression soft and calm, seeing the man who had finally chosen to be a father over being a monster. The dragon had not retired. He had simply changed the nature of his fire. He stood by the window, his gaze directed toward his woman and his baby, conveying an emotional gravity that promised a new, brighter reign. The silence of the tower was no longer empty. It was full of the quiet, rhythmic breathing of a future where his daughter would never have to run.